Chief Obalola,
Hide your goods before he sees them.
if he likes it, it's no longer yours.
I like that. I want it. You don't deserve to have it. It's mine. Guards pack everything for me. It now belongs to me.
Please, don't take it.
Chief! There is no more room.
Then build another storehouse. How much food does one man need? All of it. I want every bag of rice, every basket of yam.
There was once a village called Olokemeji, and if there was one thing everybody in that village agreed on, it was that nobody had ever seen a man as greedy as Chief Obalola. The chief did not just like wealth, he wanted everything. He wanted every bag of rice, every goat, every basket of yam, every piece of land, every chicken, every egg. And if he saw somebody with something beautiful, the first thing that entered his mind was how he could make it his own. The villagers often joked among themselves that if greed was looking for somewhere to live, it would pack all its bags and move straight into Chief Obalola's heart, because there was no better place for it to stay. Everybody feared him, not because he was kind or wise, but because nobody knew what he might collect from them next. Whenever somebody harvested a good farm, the chief would suddenly remember that there was a new tax. Whenever a fisherman returned from the river with plenty of fish, the chief would convince him that the river belonged to the palace, so a large portion of the fish naturally belonged to him. Whenever somebody bought a new goat, the chief somehow found a reason why the goat should spend the rest of its life inside the palace, and because nobody wanted trouble, everybody simply obeyed him. Even though deep inside, they were tired of watching one man become richer while everybody else became poorer. The funny thing was that no matter how much the chief already had, he was never satisfied. His palace was filled with bags of rice, baskets of beans, piles of yam, jars of palm oil, smoked fish, dried meat, expensive clothes, beautiful beads, and enough food to feed the entire village for many years. But each morning, he woke up thinking about what else he could collect before the day ended. Even his 3 wives had stopped trying to understand him, because anytime they asked him why he needed so much food, he always answered that a wise man prepared for tomorrow, and the women would quietly look at each other, because, according to the chief, tomorrow never seemed to arrive since he kept preparing for it every single day. One hot afternoon, the chief sat outside his palace eating what could only be described as a feast. There was roasted meat, fresh fish, pounded yam, soup, fried plantain, roasted corn, and enough food on one table to satisfy 10 grown men. Servants stood behind him, waving fans, while others chased away flies as though even the flies needed permission before coming close to the chief. One stubborn fly landed on a piece of roasted meat, and the chief became so annoyed that he ordered one of his servants to arrest the fly.
Arrest that fly. I want it dead.
The servant looked around in confusion, because he had never heard of anybody arresting a fly before. But since arguing with the chief was never a good idea, he stretched out both hands and began chasing the poor insect around, while the other servant struggled not to laugh. After several minutes, the fly escaped, and the chief blamed the servant for allowing a criminal to run away. 2 old men passing outside the palace whispered to each other that if flies had started committing crimes in the village, then perhaps mosquitoes would soon begin paying taxes, and they quickly walked away before the chief heard them. Not long after that, Mama Shade arrived carrying a small basket covered with a clean piece of cloth. She greeted the chief respectfully and explained that her family had managed to gather 6 fresh eggs, and according to tradition, they had come to present 3 eggs to the palace as their yearly tribute. The chief removed the cloth, counted the eggs one by one, and after looking at them for a few moments, he calmly picked up all 6 eggs and handed the woman her empty basket. Mama Shade reminded him that her children had not eaten eggs in many weeks and begged him to leave at least 3 for the family. But the chief simply smiled and convinced himself that he was helping her household because, according to him, if the children ate too many eggs, they would become too strong and stubborn. The poor woman walked away carrying an empty basket. Her little boy asked where the eggs had gone, and all she could do was tell him that the chief had borrowed them, even though both of them knew those eggs would never return. That evening, the villagers gathered beneath the great Iroko tree, as they usually did after a long day of work, and instead of talking about famine, marriages, or festivals, everybody found themselves talking about Chief Obalola. One man complained that the chief had collected his biggest goat, another said the chief had taxed his fishing net, while somebody else joked that he had accidentally stood too close to the palace wall, and the chief claimed that even a shadow had entered royal property and therefore deserved to pay tax. Everybody laughed because the story sounded ridiculous until another villager admitted that he believed it because with Chief Obalola, nothing was impossible. One elderly woman finally reminded everybody that greed never stayed small because once it found a home inside a person's heart, it continued growing until it swallowed every good thing inside them. And although everybody nodded sadly, nobody imagined just how true those words would soon become. Inside the palace, the chief spent the rest of the evening walking proudly through his storehouses, admiring everything he owned. Every building was overflowing with food, while outside the palace, many families struggled to find even one proper meal. The oldest of his wives gently suggested that perhaps it was time to share some of the food with the hungry villagers, but the chief immediately refused, explaining that if he gave people food today, they would only come back tomorrow. The youngest wife quietly reminded him that hungry people naturally looked for food every day, but the chief insisted that his barns were meant for emergencies. When one of the wives asked what kind of emergency he was waiting for, since the entire village was already hungry, he confidently answered that the real emergency would happen the day he himself became hungry, and all three women simply looked at one another because they had finally accepted that there was no point arguing with a man who believed his own stomach was more important than an entire village. As the days passed, the weather became worse, the rivers slowly dried up, the farms turned brown, and the once green fields that had fed the entire village became nothing but dry land covered with dust. The farmers woke up every morning hoping to see dark clouds gathering in the sky, but each day the sun rose brighter than the day before, and by afternoon the heat became so unbearable that even the birds searched for shade. The elders gathered everybody together and encouraged the villagers to help one another by sharing whatever little food they still had, because they believed no family should sleep hungry while another family still had something to eat. And although everybody agreed with those wise words, there was one person who never intended to share anything, and that person was Chief Obalola. Because while the rest of the village worried about surviving together, the chief worried only about protecting his own barns, as though all the food in the world still would not be enough for him. Before long, people started eating whatever they could find. Some gathered wild fruits from the bush, while others boiled leaves that normally would never have been used for food. Mothers often pretended they had already eaten so their children would not feel guilty taking the last meal in the house. Fathers spent entire days searching for anything that could keep the families alive. Yet, every evening, delicious smells floated from the palace kitchen. Roasted meat, fresh soup, fresh fish, boiled yam filled the air, making the hunger outside the palace walls feel even worse. Little children would stand outside their compounds breathing in those wonderful smells before innocently asking their mothers who was cooking such delicious food, and the mothers would sadly answer that it was the palace, because while smells belonged to everybody, the food belonged only to the chief. One afternoon, several elders gathered enough courage to visit the palace, hoping that perhaps the chief would finally show compassion. They explained that the famine had become worse than anybody expected, that old people were becoming weak, children were sleeping with empty stomachs, and families who had once been comfortable could no longer feed themselves. They begged the chief to open just one of his many barns because even a small amount of food would save many lives. But the chief simply smiled and advised them to pray harder because according to him, prayer was the key. Prayer was free. The elders quietly reminded him that they had been praying every single day, but the chief insisted that perhaps they needed to pray even harder. After hearing those words, the elders left the palace with heavy hearts because they realized they were asking kindness from a man whose heart had forgotten what kindness even looked like. That night, something very unusual happened. Although the chief had eaten enough food for several people, his stomach suddenly began growling louder than it ever had before. He drank water, hoping the strange feeling would disappear, but it only became worse. He ordered the cooks to prepare more food and they brought him another feast. Yet, after eating everything placed before him, he still felt hungry. He walked around wondering why nothing seemed able to satisfy him, because throughout his life, food had always been one of the few things that made him happy. But now, even his favorite meals tasted ordinary and left him wanting something more. He could not explain it, but deep inside him, he felt as though he was searching for something he had never tasted before. Something special, something rare, something that nobody else in the world possessed. Early the next morning, he summoned every hunter in the village and ordered them to search every farm, every riverbank, every hill, and every old plantation for the biggest and rarest yam anybody had ever seen. The hunters searched all day under the hot sun, but when they returned, they admitted that although they had found many fine yams, none was extraordinary enough to satisfy the chief's impossible request. The chief became frustrated because he refused to believe that there was nothing left for him to own. Then, one of the older hunters quietly reminded everybody that there was still one place nobody had searched, the sacred forest. Immediately, the room became silent because every child in Olokemeji grew up hearing stories about that mysterious forest. People believed the ancestors protected it and nobody entered without permission because strange things were said to happen there. The village priest respectfully advised the chief not to go anywhere near the sacred forest, explaining that some places were protected for reasons human beings could not understand. But Chief Obalola laughed loudly and dismissed every warning, telling them that stories were only meant to frighten children and that no spirit would dare stand in the way of their chief. Later that afternoon, without informing anybody, the chief secretly picked up his walking stick and made his way towards the sacred forest. Even his own guards were unwilling to accompany him. The path leading into the forest had almost disappeared beneath weeds, showing that very few people had walked there in many years. At first, everything seemed peaceful. Colorful birds flew from tree to tree, butterflies floated through the air, and gentle streams flowed quietly between ancient trees. But the deeper the chief walked, the stranger everything became. The birds suddenly stopped singing, the wind disappeared, the insects became silent, and an uncomfortable feeling settled over the forest as though somebody unseen was watching every step he took. Several times, he heard branches breaking behind him, only to turn around and find nobody there. He laughed nervously, telling himself there was nothing to fear. Yet, his heart continued beating faster with every step until he finally reached a beautiful clearing unlike anything he had ever seen in his entire life. The grass looked greener than emerald. Sparkling flowers covered the ground, and in the middle of the clearing stood a single mound of rich dark soil where the largest, most beautiful yam anybody could ever imagine was growing. Its golden brown skin seemed to glow beneath the afternoon sunlight, and for a few moments the chief simply stood there, staring, because he immediately believed that all his dreams had finally come true. Chief Obalola completely forgot about the warnings he had received. The only thing he could see was the enormous yam before him. It was unlike any yam he had ever seen in his life. It looked as though the earth itself had carefully hidden it away for many years, waiting for somebody to discover it. Without wasting another second, he dropped to his knees, picked up the hoe he had brought with him, and began digging around the giant yam. The soil was surprisingly soft, making it easy for him to dig, but no matter how much he uncovered the yam, it seemed to continue going deeper into the ground. He laughed happily, convincing himself that the larger the yam became, the more valuable it would be. By the time he had spent almost an hour digging, sweat covered his entire body, his expensive wrapper was stained with mud, and for the first time in many years, the chief had actually worked harder than any farmer in his own village. Yet, instead of complaining, he became even more determined because greed had given him strength than ordinary hunger never could. After struggling for what felt like forever, the giant yam finally came loose from the ground. With one powerful pull, the chief dragged it out and immediately lost his balance, sending both himself and the yam rolling across the ground until he landed flat on his back, breathing heavily, while the yam rested proudly on top of his stomach. He remained there, for several seconds, trying to catch his breath, before slowly pushing the yam aside and joking to himself that the yam had almost killed the very man who had rescued it. No sooner had those words left his mouth than a calm voice quietly answered that nobody had asked to be rescued. The chief froze completely. Every hair on his body stood upright, and he slowly looked around the clearing, expecting somebody to step out from behind the trees. But there was nobody. The forest remained perfectly silent. The birds had disappeared again, and even the wind seemed afraid to move. He swallowed hard and asked who had spoken. The same calm voice answered that it had been the yam. The chief immediately shook his head because nothing about that answer made sense. He convinced himself that the long walk, the hot weather, and his hunger had begun affecting his mind, so he laughed nervously and insisted that the yam would not talk. But the voice politely reminded him that just because he had never heard one speak before did not mean it was impossible. For several moments, the chief simply stared at the yam, unable to decide whether to run away or continue pretending everything was normal. He eventually stretched out one trembling hand and gently touched the yam, half expecting it to disappear, but it remained exactly where it was. The voice then asked him why he looked so surprised after all human beings spent their whole lives believing they knew everything, until life introduced them to something they had never imagined before. The chief slowly admitted that he had never met a talking yam, and the yam calmly replied that it had never met a human being whose greed was bigger than its own size, and if it had eyes, it would have rolled them at the chief. Despite the fear creeping into his heart, greed quickly returned, and before long, the chief stopped thinking about how strange the talking yam was and started thinking about how much money it could bring him. He imagined kings traveling from distant kingdoms just to hear a yam speak. He imagined charging people bags of cowries before allowing them to see it. He imagined becoming the richest ruler the world had ever known, and the more he imagined these things, the wider his smile became. But before he could celebrate, the yam quietly interrupted his thoughts by asking whether becoming richer than everybody else had ever truly made him happy. The question caught the chief by surprise, because nobody had ever asked him something like that before. He quickly dismissed it and answered that happiness came from having more than everybody else. The yam became unusually quiet for a moment before softly saying that if that were true, then the chief should have been the happiest man in the village. Yet somehow, he remained the hungriest man it had ever met. The chief frowned because those words somehow annoyed him more than any insult ever could. Without saying another word, he bent down, lifted the yam onto his shoulders and began carrying it back towards the village. Although the yam was unbelievably heavy, the chief refused to leave it behind because by now he had convinced himself that he possessed the greatest treasure on earth. However, as he walked through the forest, the yam gently reminded him that carrying it did not mean he owned it. The chief laughed confidently and answered that everything he carried belonged to him. The yam quietly replied that those were exactly the words that had created all the problems waiting for him back in the village, and although the chief did not understand what that meant, he would soon discover that bringing the talking yam home was the beginning of the greatest lesson his life would ever receive. By the time Chief Obalola reached the edge of the village, the sun had already begun setting, and although his shoulders ached, he refused to let anybody help him because he feared someone might discover the strange treasure he had found. Whenever villagers greeted him, he simply nodded and continued walking as quickly as he could, hoping to reach the palace before darkness completely covered the village. A few women returning from the stream greeted him respectfully, but just as they were about to continue their journey, the yam quietly asked the chief whether he planned to greet them properly or whether greeting people had also become too expensive for him. The chief almost dropped the yam in shock, but quickly pretended he had stumbled on a stone. The woman looked at him with concern, asking whether he was alright, and he quickly forced a smile, assuring them that he was only tired after a long walk. As soon as he reached the palace, he rushed into his private room, locked the door from inside, closed every window, and carefully placed the giant yam on the floor. He stood there staring at it for several seconds, wondering whether everything that had happened inside the sacred forest had simply been a dream. The room remained completely silent, and for a brief moment, he smiled, believing perhaps the yam had finally stopped talking. He slowly moved closer, bent down, and gently touched it with one finger, hoping to confirm it was now an ordinary yam. But almost immediately, the yam asked him whether he had finished doubting reality or whether he intended to spend the rest of the evening poking vegetables. The chief jumped backward so violently that he knocked over his stool before staring at the yam with wide frightened eyes. The yam calmly reminded him that if he kept reacting like that every time it spoke, then living together was going to be very exhausting. Little by little, the fear inside the chief began disappearing and curiosity slowly replaced it. He sat opposite the yam and began wondering what kind of mysterious thing had found its way into his palace. He asked the yam whether it could perform miracles, whether it could produce gold, whether it could make him richer than every king who had ever lived. But the yam quietly answered that it had not come into his life to make him richer, because riches had never been his real problem. It explained that there were people who owned very little and still slept peacefully every night, while there were others who possessed almost everything and still woke up every morning desperately searching for more. The chief laughed because he believed only poor people spoke that way, but the yam simply reminded him that if wealth alone could satisfy a human heart, then he would not have risked his life entering the sacred forest in search of one more yam, despite already owning enough food to feed the village for years. Before the chief could respond, someone knocked gently on the door. It was his oldest wife, bringing him supper. She politely informed him that the food was getting cold and wondered why he had locked himself inside all evening. The chief quickly covered the talking yam with a large cloth before opening the door just enough to collect the tray of food. He hurriedly thanked her and closed the door. He uncovered the yam again and proudly announced that he was about to enjoy one of the finest meals in the entire kingdom. But before taking the first bite, the yam quietly asked whether he had ever wondered what the hungry children outside the palace walls were eating that night. The chief immediately lost his appetite for a moment before convincing himself that the suffering of other people was not his responsibility. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, those words refused to leave his mind, and for the first time in many years, every mouthful of food somehow tasted heavier than before. Later that night, while the entire palace slept, the chief remained awake, unable to stop thinking about everything the yam had said. He eventually lay down, hoping sleep would silence the strange thoughts filling his mind, but just as he was about to drift off, the yam gently reminded him about Mama Sade's 6 eggs. The chief immediately turned over, pretending not to hear anything, but the yam continued by reminding him about the fisherman whose catch he had taken, the widow whose goat he had collected, the young farmer whose harvest he had seized, and countless families who had left the palace carrying nothing but disappointment. The chief covered his ears with both hands, but somehow the yam's calm voice sounded even louder inside his own heart than it did inside the room. He finally shouted for the yam to stop talking because he wanted to sleep, but the yam quietly explained that sleep was difficult for people whose conscience had finally decided to wake up. When morning arrived, the chief had already made up his mind. He convinced himself that the only solution was to get rid of the talking yam before it completely destroyed his peace. He wrapped it inside several thick pieces of cloth, placed it inside a large basket, covered it with dried leaves, and quietly slipped out of the palace through the back gate before anyone else woke up. His plan was simple. He would travel to the neighboring kingdom, sell the talking yam to the highest bidder, become even richer than before, and finally enjoy a peaceful life again. However, what the chief did not realize was that some lessons cannot be sold, some truths cannot be buried, and some voices refuse to remain silent no matter how tightly they are covered. And before the sun reached the middle of the sky, the entire village of Olokemeji would witness the beginning of the greatest embarrassment Chief Obalola had ever experienced. With a large basket, Chief Obalola quietly made his way through the village, hoping nobody would stop him. Every few steps, he looked behind him to make sure nobody was following, because the last thing he wanted was for anybody to discover what he was carrying. Unfortunately for him, the village market was already becoming busy. The chief believed he would pass through the market without any problems, but just as he reached the busiest part of the road, the yam cheerfully greeted everybody from inside the basket, wishing the entire market a wonderful morning. The chief froze so suddenly that the basket almost slipped from his shoulder. Several traders looked around, trying to discover where the strange voice had come from, while others laughed and insisted someone was playing a joke on them. The chief quickly forced a smile and claimed that he had simply been practicing a speech for the next village meeting. But before anybody could believe him, The yam loudly wondered why the chief was lying so early in the morning, because according to the yam, people normally waited until afternoon before telling that many lies. The traders exchanged confused looks while several children gathered around the basket asking what was inside it. The chief tried to continue walking, but the children followed him, laughing and begging him to show them the talking thing hidden beneath the clothes. Just as the chief thought the situation could not become any worse, Mama Shade appeared. She greeted the chief respectfully and moved aside to allow him pass. But before either of them could continue, the yam loudly reminded everybody that this was the same woman whose 6 eggs the chief had collected while pretending he was protecting her reputation. The entire market suddenly became silent. Mama Shade slowly looked at the chief while the traders stopped pretending to arrange their goods because every single person wanted to hear what would happen next. The chief laughed nervously and insisted that nobody should listen to a talking yam because vegetables obviously did not understand village laws. But the yam calmly reminded everybody of the exact words the chief had used that day, including how he claimed the children should fast for the prosperity of the kingdom, and before long, many traders could no longer hide their laughter because the story sounded even more ridiculous the second time. Chief Obalola felt his face becoming hotter with every passing second. He had spent years making the villagers fear him, but now they were struggling not to laugh in front of him. He quickly hurried away, pretending he had important matters to attend to, while the children happily followed him. The chief continued walking without looking back, while the yam quietly reminded him that respect collected through fear usually disappeared the moment people found something stronger to laugh at, and nothing was stronger than the truth. Instead of leaving for the neighboring kingdom as he had planned, the chief hurried back to the palace because he realized traveling with a talking yam was impossible. The moment he entered his private room, he dropped the basket onto the floor and angrily demanded to know why the yam seemed determined to ruin his life. The yam calmly explained that it had no interest in ruining his life because his greed had already been doing that for so many years. All it was doing was making sure everybody finally saw what had always been hidden. The chief insisted that he was the ruler of the village and deserved everything he possessed, but the yam gently asked whether being a ruler meant taking from hungry widows, collecting eggs from poor mothers, and locking away food while children cried themselves to sleep. That question remained hanging inside the room because even the chief could not bring himself to answer it. While they were still talking, another knock sounded at the palace door. This time, it was a messenger informing the chief that the village elders wished to see him immediately. The chief reluctantly followed the messenger to the meeting placed beneath the great Iroko tree, where almost the entire village had gathered. The elders respectfully explained that the famine had become even worse during the past few days and once again pleaded with the chief to open at least one of his storehouses because many families had reached a point where they no longer knew what their next meal would come from. The chief listened quietly before beginning another long speech about patience, sacrifice, and preparing for tomorrow. But before he could finish, the yam loudly reminded everybody that there were 47 bags of yam hidden behind a western storehouse together with several rooms filled with beans, dried fish, palm oil, and other food. The entire gathering became silent as every face slowly turned towards the chief, and for the very first time since becoming ruler of Olokemeji, Chief Obalola realized that the greatest danger in his life was no longer hunger or poverty, but a simple talking yam that refused to keep his secret. For several long moments, nobody spoke. The villagers simply stared at Chief Obalola, waiting for him to deny what they had just heard, while the chief himself stood completely, still trying to think of something, anything that could save him from the embarrassment. Slowly, he forced a smile and explained that nobody in their right mind should believe the words of a talking yam because if people started taking advice from vegetables, then perhaps they would soon begin asking goats to settle family dispute. But although a few people laughed politely, most of the villagers remained quiet because deep inside, many of them had always suspected that the chief was hiding far more food than anyone knew. The oldest elder slowly stepped forward and respectfully asked the chief whether the talking yam was telling the truth. The chief immediately denied everything, insisting that there were no hidden barns and no secret rooms. But before anybody could respond, the oldest palace guard quietly lowered his head because he knew exactly what the yam was talking about. He had personally guarded the western storehouse for many years, and although he had been ordered never to allow anybody inside, he could no longer ignore the suffering he saw every day among the villagers. After standing silently for several moments, he finally admitted that behind the western wall there was indeed another storage room that very few people knew existed. The crowd gasped in disbelief, while the chief looked at the guard as though he had just been betrayed by his own shadow. Without wasting another moment, the elders asked several guards to open the western storehouse, and after a few moments, they returned looking completely shocked. They confirmed that everything the yam had said was true. Behind the false wall were countless bags of yam, sacks of beans, baskets of maize, jars of palm oil, smoked fish, dried meat, and enough food to keep the village alive for many months. The crowd became completely silent. Some women quietly began crying, while several old men simply shook their heads, unable to understand how one man could watch his own people suffer while so much food remained hidden only a short distance away. Mama Shade looked towards the palace and remembered every night her children had slept hungry, while all along, food had been locked behind those walls. Chief Obalola looked around at the faces surrounding him, and for the first time, he did not see frightened villagers. He saw exhausted mothers, weak old men, hungry children, and hardworking farmers whose kindness he had rewarded with selfishness. One young boy stepped forward and innocently asked his mother whether all that food had been waiting there while his little sister cried from hunger. The mother could not answer because tears had already filled her eyes. The chief slowly lowered his head because no excuse he could think of sounded large enough to cover the pain standing before him. The oldest elder gently walked towards the chief and carefully removed the coral beads that symbolized his authority. Nobody tried to stop him because even the chief himself no longer believed he deserved them. The elder then took the royal staff from his hands and quietly explained that a leader who loved his possessions more than his people could no longer be trusted. He reminded everyone gathered there that a true chief was never chosen because he could collect the most wealth, but because he could protect the greatest number of lives. The villagers remained silent because there was no joy in watching a man fall, especially one who could have become a great leader if only he had learned the lessons much earlier. That evening, Chief Obalola returned to the palace alone, without his royal staff, without his coral beads, and without the respect he had spent years demanding from everybody around him. He walked slowly through the empty corridors until he reached his private room where the talking yam rested quietly on the floor. For the first time since bringing it home, the yam said nothing because there was nothing left to expose. Every secret had already found its way into the open. The chief sat on the floor, staring at his hands, and after a very long silence, he finally admitted to himself that throughout his entire life, he had believed wealth would make people admire him, but instead, it had only made them fear him. And now that the fear had disappeared, he realized how lonely he had truly become. The yam gently reminded him that losing his title was painful, but losing his humanity would have been far worse. And although these words hurt, they also became the first words that finally reached the part of his heart greed had hidden for many years. The following morning, something happened that nobody in Olokemeji had ever witnessed before. The great palace gates, which had remained tightly closed for many years, slowly opened before sunrise. The guards looked at one another in confusion because no order had been given for anybody to enter or leave yet. The gates remained open as though they had been waiting for that very moment. Villagers passing by stopped to watch from a distance, wondering what was happening because they had become so used to seeing the palace keep everything inside that an open gate felt almost impossible to believe. Before long, Chief Obalola himself walked out wearing a simple wrapper instead of his expensive royal clothes, and for the first time since anybody could remember, he walked without servants following behind him, without drummers announcing his arrival, and without anybody shouting praises in his name. He simply stood quietly in front of the people who had slowly gathered outside, and after looking at their faces for a long time, he lowered his head because he finally understood that asking for forgiveness was far more difficult than collecting taxes. After standing there silently for several moments, he admitted before everyone that he had been a selfish leader and confessed that he had spent too many years believing that wealth was more important than people. He explained that he had allowed greed to blind him until he could no longer see the suffering around him. but the villagers remained quiet because they had heard promises before, and words alone could not erase years of hunger. Then, one elderly man calmly reminded him that empty stomachs were never filled with apologies, and several people nodded in agreement, because although hearing the truth was important, it was not enough to feed hungry families. The chief slowly looked back towards the palace before raising his hands and ordering every single storehouse to be opened. At first, none of the servants moved because they thought they had misunderstood him, but when he repeated the order, they finally rushed towards the barns and threw every door wide open. The villagers stood in complete disbelief as mountains of food that were remained hidden for so long were finally brought outside. Chief Obalola announced that nobody would pay anything and that every family should take only what they truly needed, so that everybody would have enough. Nobody moved because they believed it might be another cruel trick. But eventually, Mama Shade slowly stepped forward, picked up a basket of food, and looked at the chief as though asking one final time whether he truly meant it. The chief simply nodded, with tears already gathering in his eyes, and that was all the villagers needed. Within a short time, laughter filled the palace courtyard. Children who had forgotten what it felt like to eat until they were satisfied smiled again. Mothers thanked one another. Fathers helped elderly people carry heavy bags home. And for the first time in many months, the sounds coming from the palace were not cries of frustration, but songs of gratitude. Days slowly turned into weeks, and little by little, the people of Olokemeji began noticing that Chief Obalola had truly changed. Instead of spending his mornings counting his wealth, he now spent them working alongside farmers, helping repair broken roofs, carrying water for elderly widows, and planting new crops. Whenever anybody thanked him, he always answered that he was only returning what should never have been taken in the first place. Trust did not return overnight because broken trust never heals that quickly, but every act of kindness slowly repaired a small piece of the damage greed had caused, until the villagers found themselves smiling whenever they saw him, instead of quietly avoiding and cursing him. One peaceful afternoon, Mama Shade visited Chief Obalola carrying a small basket covered with a clean cloth. When she opened it, the chief saw 6 fresh eggs, exactly the same number he had once taken from her family many months earlier. He immediately shook his head and tried to refuse the gift, explaining that he no longer deserved such kindness. But Mama Shade gently smiled and reminded him that forgiveness was one of the greatest gifts anybody could ever receive, because a heart that refused to forgive eventually became just as heavy as a heart filled with greed. The chief accepted the eggs with tears in his eyes, not because of their value, but because they represented something he thought he had lost forever: the trust of his people. As everyone stood together, laughing, talking, sharing food, the talking yam finally spoke once more and explained that it had never come into the chief's life to punish him, but to save him. It revealed that long ago, there had been a ruler in Olokemeji who believed that the greatest duty of any leader was to feed the hungry, protect the weak, and place the needs of the people above his own. After that good ruler passed away, the ancestors watched many selfish leaders rise and fall until they finally decided to send a lesson instead of another warning. And that lesson had taken the form of an ordinary yam, because sometimes the greatest wisdom arrives in the most unexpected way. The yam quietly explained that throughout the entire journey it had never told a single lie. It had only spoken the truth that the chief's own conscience had been trying to tell him for many years, but which greed had refused to hear. Just as the yam finished speaking, dark clouds slowly gathered above the village, and within moments, the first drops of rain began falling. Everyone looked towards the sky before joyful laughter spread across the entire village, knowing the difficult season had finally come to an end. Chief Obalola allowing every drop to wash over him, and when he looked down again, the talking yam had become an ordinary yam once more. It never spoke another word. The chief gently picked it up, carried it home, cooked it, and instead of keeping it for himself, he shared every single piece with the people of Olokemeji, because he had finally learned that the sweetest meal in life is the one shared with others. And from that day forward, whenever children in the village saw somebody becoming selfish, they would laugh and remind each other not to become another Chief Obalola. Otherwise, the ancestors might decide to send another talking yam to teach them the same lesson. And that is why people still say today that no amount of wealth can ever make a greedy heart rich, because true riches are found in kindness, generosity, honesty, and the love of the people whose lives become better because of the good we choose to do for them. Thank you so much for watching this story. I truly appreciate every single one of you. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, leave a comment telling me your favorite part, and share this story with your family and friends. Thank you once again for watching, and until our next story, take good care of yourselves, stay kind to one another, and I will see you in the next video.